Yeah, cold nights I must confess, yeah. There's something in my soul that kept telling me to hold on. Even when the world turned its back on me, I knew deep inside that I wasn't meant to be bad. And I was on love. Still stay strong. Facing my life. When my faith kept me going on. Don't tell me
Welcome to When I Was Homeless, a podcast that shares real stories of resilience and hope. I'm your host, Gabby Cunningham, and today we're having an honest conversation about homelessness, not as statistics, but as human experiences. Each story matters, each voice deserves to be heard, and each guest brings us closer to understanding. But today, I'm not interviewing a guest. Instead, I'm going to be sharing some information about an issue that's close to my heart. As many of you know, this podcast wouldn't be possible without the work of For My Bonus Child. And with the holidays upon us, it seemed prudent to take a pause and talk about our mission and also about why this podcast is so important. We've seen a real surge in listeners lately, and I believe now, more than ever, people are ready to listen, to understand, and maybe even lend a hand. Now, when we think of homelessness, we often picture someone sleeping on a park bench, right? But the reality is far more complex, especially for families. Persistent or chronic homelessness is a cycle of instability, often lasting for years. Imagine a family constantly moving between motels, shelters, or even doubling up with relatives, never having a place to truly call home. This is the reality for many families right here in Miami and across the country. Here in Miami-Dade County, the latest count identified 2,892 individuals experiencing homelessness. And while it's hard to get that exact number, we know that families with children are a significant part of that, often trapped in a cycle of motel living. Nationwide, that number jumps to a staggering 582,462 people, with 183,814 of those families with children. And these numbers likely just scratch the surface because many cases of homelessness, especially among families, go uncounted. I remember a story, let's call her Maria. Maria and her two kids were stuck in the cycle for years. Eviction after eviction, job loss, then a car breakdown, her mom got sick. It was like one thing after another. They were constantly on the brink, living in fear, and the kids were struggling in school. In fact, her son, we'll call him Jose, had been held back in 2 separate grades. So he was 2 grades behind and was threatened to be held back again. This is what persistent homelessness often looks like, a constant struggle for stability. We ask, why does this happen? How did we get here? And of course, there's poverty. A lack of affordable housing and low wages are a huge factor, but it's so much more than that. Many families are fleeing abusive situations and end up with limited resources and support. But then there's also fear, right? We interviewed a guest a couple of weeks ago, and they were just mentioning the fear of leaving because they didn't have resources of their own. That is a reality that many people who are in abusive situations face. Where will I go? And how will I support myself and my kids and my pet and my mom who lives with me and is bedbound? And if they make the brave decision to leave that situation, they find themselves in a cycle of homelessness. Then, of course, there are the unexpected crises, right? A sudden illness, job loss, even a family vehicle breaking down, which is the only transportation to a job 45 minutes, an hour away, can put a family over the edge, especially if they're already struggling. especially if they're already living far from work because that's where they can afford to live and the wages are better in a different area. And then, of course, there's the system itself. But here's what most people don't realize. The official definition of chronic homelessness, according to the U.S. government, often requires a mental health, or a substance abuse diagnosis. This leaves out so many families who don't fit that criteria, making them ineligible for all kinds of assistance. They're just overlooked and underserved, and it's not okay. They find themselves in an inescapable cycle. I call it the motel trap. Motels seem like a solution at first, but they're incredibly expensive in the long run, draining families' resources and making it harder to save for a deposit on an apartment. They're not able to pay into the economy and build up their credit. So even qualifying for an apartment, if they beat the odds and are able to save for a security deposit, will make getting into a place an insurmountable task. Many families lack the support system or resources to navigate the complex housing system, apply for benefits, or find stable employment. There's the trauma and stress that comes from just being in this fight or flight mode all the time, constantly, for years. The constant instability takes a toll, both mentally and physically, and it makes it even harder to see hope or try to reach for a better existence, a life outside of what I'm dealing with now, because you just don't have the mental capacity to get through. It breaks you down. Of course, I'm talking from the perspective of an adult, but what about the children who are also affected? Imagine constantly changing schools, not having a quiet place to do homework, or even feeling ashamed of where you live, or the fact that your clothes smell weird because your mom is washing them in a tiny motel sink basin. Homelessness affects children so deeply, impacting their education, their health, their social and emotional well-being. It increases their risk of homelessness later, too. It's a cycle we have to break. Let's talk about mom and dad, and not mom and dad of the children, mom and dad of the adults, the elderly. Especially here in South Florida, where multi-generational families are the norm, the elderly are more vulnerable to health problems, to isolation, to dangers of living on the streets. They may have chronic conditions that are made worse by homelessness, and they also face ageism and discrimination when trying to access services. We need to do more to support our elderly population and ensure they have safe and stable housing, whether they're in a multi-generational family facing persistent homelessness or whether they're all on their own, where it's lonely and it's scary. And they're raised in a generation where if they're not mentally well, they're not getting resources for it because there's a shame and a stigma. We have to do more. Something that's close to my heart, because I do have a child with a physical disability, are those with disabilities. They're disproportionately represented among the homeless population. They face challenges with accessibility. Oh my goodness, I can't stress that enough. It was not until my own daughter was in a wheelchair that I noticed how inaccessible our world is. And I'm disappointed that it took my own experience to start seeing. But the reality is, there are so many accessibility challenges, even in the best case scenarios. But imagine having to live in a motel with no elevator, and the only available room is on a second or third floor. They face challenges with getting the health care they need. They have challenges with being able to stay with a doctor they know, like, and trust. Because if you're moving constantly, you may not be able to stay in a neighborhood that makes it easy for you to see your preferred practitioner or someone who understands your very specific ailment. They need help finding employment. And often the precursor to that is getting into physical therapy or getting an occupational therapist or an aide who can help them even get into medical transportation to go to a job. They're more vulnerable to victimization and exploitation. We need to create a system that is truly inclusive and meets the needs of everyone. And one person can't do it all. And we can't save the world with a podcast. But if we understand what the issues are collectively, we all know someone who knows someone who knows something that can help us fix these huge, huge problems. That's where programs like our Shelter of Hope come in. We provide up to 2 years of support. Yes, I did say 2 years, because we understand that breaking the cycle of persistent homelessness takes time. We start with emergency housing grants, helping families secure safe and stable accommodation. Then we work with them on financial literacy, budgeting, and credit repair. And finally, we provide ongoing aftercare to ensure they maintain their housing and thrive. And I cannot stress the importance of aftercare. There are incredible programs available to those who are blessed enough to get into them. But once they're out of that initial emergency period, they're on their own. And that's not a successful model for the majority of people. The majority of people need someone who cares following them over an extended period of time, who can be a safety net when systems fail. Now, I know this is heavy stuff, especially during the holidays. But here's the thing. We can all make a difference. If you know a family struggling with housing instability, reach out, offer support, a listening ear, or help connect them with resources. You can also support organizations like For My Bonus Child by volunteering your time, joining our board, or making a donation. Every little bit helps, and every mind that joins the collective gets us one step closer to coming up with a comprehensive solution to an incredibly large problem that isn't being addressed. There's something else that I would like to point out, and that is the hidden costs of this lifestyle. Having lived it myself, but also having worked with others and living with people who have been in it much longer, I recognize that there are so many hidden costs of this lifestyle. Imagine the expense of constantly moving, paying for laundry, or, even just feeding your children in a place where there are no kitchens. You have a microwave and a mini fridge. Often these places are in food deserts, so there may not be access to fresh foods, fruits, vegetables. You're eating out of tins, you're eating out of cans, you're eating out of packages. Families often sacrifice meals or health care to afford a motel room. They often have to store their belongings in storages that get very expensive over time. And if they miss even one payment, they lose everything. Kids miss out on school or extracurricular activities. It's a constant juggling act. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, why don't they just get a job? But it's not that simple. Imagine trying to hold down a job when you don't have a stable address, reliable transportation, or access to childcare. These are the barriers we help families overcome. And what is even more surprising, and I mentioned it a little while ago, is that many facing persistent homelessness are employed. In fact, many are working 2 or 3 jobs. Breaking out of the cycle of poverty, homelessness, or even motel living is challenging when wages do not keep pace with the housing market, as evidenced right here in Miami and across the country. There are some compelling YouTube documentaries that showcase the real stories of individuals facing these issues. There's one in particular where they work at a very magical place and they're not able to afford housing. But I will include links to those in the show notes at www.formybonuschild.org. To access them, navigate the top menu bar and click on podcast. I really encourage you to watch those YouTube videos because they are so compelling, so insightful, and honestly quite heartbreaking because you see that these people are doing everything they're supposed to be doing. I also encourage you to do your research online. I dropped some statistics in this podcast, and I got them from reliable sources, which you also have access to. For instance, Miami-Dade Homeless Trust. You can check them out at www.homelesstrust.org. There is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development at www.hud.gov. And there is the National Alliance to End Homelessness. You can find them at www.endhomelessness.org. Friends, this podcast was never meant to be a plea for donations. It's about something much deeper than that. It's about opening our eyes, our ears, and our hearts to the realities of homelessness. It's about recognizing the strength and resilience of those who have faced this struggle and understanding that any one of us could find ourselves in a similar situation. Today, we dived into the complexities of persistent homelessness, a cycle that traps individuals and families in a constant state of uncertainty and hardship. It's a reality that's often hidden in plain sight, and it's easy to turn away from the discomfort it brings. But I believe that by truly listening to these stories, by understanding the challenges and the systemic barriers, we can begin to dismantle the stereotypes that keep us from seeing the humanity in everyone. This holiday season, as we gather with loved ones and count our blessings, let's extend our compassion to those who are struggling to find a safe and stable place to call home. Let's remember that behind every statistic, there's a person with hopes, dreams, and a story to tell. And perhaps, by working together, we can help light the way toward a future where everyone has a place to belong. That's it for now. We'll return on December 31st with another inspiring story from an incredible guest I can't wait for you to meet. Until next time, please remember that homelessness is not an identity. It's an experience that can happen to anyone. If you'd like to learn more or get involved, please visit www.formybonuschild.org. Until next time, this is Gabby Cunningham, reminding you that every story matters, including yours.